be sharing their presentations with us. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and I will turn it over to Adele.
Oops. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you this morning. My presentation this morning is on climate change impacts, and I will be looking at the Caribbean and the Bahamas in particular. Just a little bit about me. I'm a senior fellow with the Climate Change Adaptation and Resilience Research Center, or the CAR Center, here at University of the Bahamas. And this was a research center that was founded in late 2019 to focus on climate change research. So in my presentation today, I'm going to have three main topics. The first is a brief overview of existing climate impacts in the Caribbean and the Bahamas. The second topic I'm going to look at are impacts of climate change that we can expect as global average temperatures rise. And I'll be particularly looking at the difference between global warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, which are two very important temperature rises to keep in mind. And the third and final topic I'll look at is a bit about the broader impacts of climate change beyond the immediate impacts that we can see, and particularly what are the impacts of climate change for sustainable development. And I hope that this provides a context for further discussion on how climate change affects all aspects of life in the Bahamas, including libraries. So first topic, the scientific evidence is very clear that climate change is already causing impacts. So we are already seeing impacts of climate change being manifested around the world. Scientific evidence is clear that the human influence, so what we have done as people, has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented over the last 2,000 years. So this area here, 1850 to 2020, we see an exponential rise in warming. And this is really due to the activities of humans. So the Industrial Revolution, which is when humans started emitting greenhouse gases, have caused this exponential rise in temperatures. So the consensus coming from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's foremost and most valued overall report on the science of climate change, came up with their latest report in 2021. And they say that there is, unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, the ocean, and the land, and that there are widespread and rapid changes that have already occurred in the atmosphere, in the ocean, in the cryosphere, and in the biosphere. So there's no remaining doubt that human influence is the cause of climate change. And as a result of this warming, there have been changes to every aspect of the environment, and this is on a global scale. So what does that mean for us here in the Caribbean and the Bahamas? When we think of some of the impacts that climate change is having on us in this region, we can immediately think of extreme hurricanes. So we are no stranger to hurricanes. Dorian, Irma, Maria, Joaquin, all of these are sobering examples of the magnitude of challenges from climate change that are facing the region. And climate change has been proven to contribute to the severity of the impacts that we experience from these hurricanes. First, the likelihood of more intense hurricanes increases with higher sea surface temperatures. And globally, we've seen sea surface temperatures have increased, and they are expected to further rise. Secondly, we've seen higher sea levels that are leading to more severe storm surges. And so the global mean sea level has been on the increase and is also expected to continue to increase. And third, More intense extreme precipitation or rain is causing greater levels of flooding. And this is also a climate driver that is increasing and is expected to continue to rise. So sort of these changes that we're seeing on the global scale in terms of sea surface temperatures, in terms of higher sea levels, and in terms of intense extreme precipitation are manifesting within the Caribbean and the Bahamas as these really intense hurricanes that we are experiencing. But it's not just hurricanes that are having an impact on the Caribbean and in the Bahamas. Small islands everywhere are already seeing other impacts from climate change. So we talked a bit about sea level rise. In addition to hurricanes, this is also contributing to coastal flooding and erosion. Changing patterns of precipitation and drought have affected important industries such as agriculture. Increased ocean temperatures have had impacts on fisheries and on other livelihoods. We see the degradation of coral reefs and mangroves, which have increased coastal erosion, and they have also contributed to loss of biodiversity. And for us in the Bahamas, as well as many small islands around the world, much of our population, our infrastructure, and our economic activity are located right along the coast, which then exposes us to more of these climate impacts. So when we turn to the second topic, which looks at, what are projected impacts to come, I want you to keep in mind that these projected impacts are on top of what we are already experiencing as a result of climate change. So moving into the second topic, looking at how the impacts of climate change increase with global warming. And here I'll be particularly looking at the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius, which are critical levels of warming that we are currently approaching. So currently we're at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. And in this section, I'm going to talk a bit about what we can expect if we meet 1.5 degrees of warming or even 2 degrees of warming. So if we think about 0.5 degree of warming, it doesn't sound like much. So if we were in a room and I had the AC set to 75 degrees and somebody said, no, that's too cold for me, bring that up to 75.5 degrees, you would look at them as if they were crazy. I mean, 0.5 degree really doesn't seem to be that much. And if we think about temperature in that way, then if we think about global warming in that way, then 0.5 degree doesn't seem to be that much, but it's actually a really big deal. And there's scientific evidence that there are significant differences in climate impacts at 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And we're going to look at what some of these differences are. One of the major impacts is with sea level rise. So at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, we can expect about 0.1 meters or 4 inches of sea level rise. Now that might not sound like much, but for small and flat islands like us in the Bahamas, this is a huge increase. This extent of sea level rise will cause coastal erosion. So we're going to lose some of our land that is located right along the coast. And we also have lots of homes and infrastructure that are located along the coast, and these will also be severely impacted. We have tended to settle right along the water in many of our islands, and that places, all of the different communities that we have on the family islands as well at high risk. Higher sea levels also mean that when a hurricane comes through, the storm surge will be higher. So we will see more places inland being affected by storm surges. So even if you don't live right on the coastline, you may still be affected by that incoming storm surge that is coming further inland. And we saw that with Dorian, where we had 20 to 30 foot storm surges coming within the interior part of Abaco. These higher sea levels also affect our beaches. So as sea levels rise, we're going to see a narrowing of our beaches, particularly in areas where there is no space for beaches to migrate inland. So this is by Saunders Beach. You all know right next to Saunders Beach is a road, so there's nowhere for that beach to go. So eventually we're going to see a narrowing and a loss of those beaches. And that's some of the, just the impacts that we can expect at 1.5 degrees of warming. And keep in mind that we are already at 1.1 degrees of warming. But if we get to 2 degrees of warming, so only half a degree higher, the changes that we can expect from climate change are expected to be significantly worse. At 2 degrees Celsius of warming, we would definitely see an increase in sea level rise, so much more than the 0.1 meters that we can expect at 1.5 degrees. However, at 2 degrees Celsius, then there is a risk that ice sheets that are located up in Greenland and Antarctica may reach a tipping point and rapidly melt. And if we see these ice sheets melt, that would be catastrophic for islands such as ours. Multi-meter sea level rise, so 2 meters of sea level rise would completely engulf the majority of our islands. And that means that we would really need to find somewhere else to live. So these are maps showing if we have 2 meters of sea level rise by the year 2100, which would be associated potentially with 2 degrees of warming, then these are areas. To the top is Grand Bahama, and to the bottom is Nassau. These are areas that would be below water level. You can see that's the majority of the islands. So quite alarming. But there are also other areas, in addition to sea level rise, where we can expect some of these impacts to be also alarming. One of these is in temperature. So for heat waves, at 1.5 degrees of warming, we can expect about 6 months where we have very high temperatures. At 2 degrees of warming, this would go up to about 8 months. That might not sound like a lot, like an extra 2 months, but it's actually quite significant. Heat waves mean that not only are the daytime temperatures high, but the nighttime temperatures are also high. So there's not a chance to cool off during the night, and that has significant health impacts. One of the ways to prevent this is to turn on a fan, to cut on your air conditioning. But as we are quite familiar with in Nassau, what happens when there is no electricity? We already experience electricity shortages, whole island blackouts, hours when you wonder why you're paying so much for electricity when it's not reliably available. And hotter temperatures and these heat waves will exacerbate those problems. Climate impacts also have implications on some of the industries that we rely on. So we can expect to see perhaps a decline of tourism. So our high season is normally when our temperatures are cooler, but if we have these longer extended periods of heat waves, then we're going to have a shorter tourism season, and you combine that with more intense hurricanes, and that means that tourism may simply decline because our islands may be less attractive for people to come and to visit. There are also differences in coral reefs being at risk. So at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we can expect between 70 to 90% of coral reefs to be at risk of dying off. If we get up to 2 degrees Celsius, then we can expect almost all coral reefs to die. Coral reefs are incredibly important for coastal protection from storms, for our fisheries industry, for our tourism industry. And so the results of losing almost all of our coral reefs would be quite catastrophic. We can also expect to see an increase in heavy rainfall events, and this has implications for flooding. So we already experience severe flooding on our islands due to heavy rainfall. And these impacts would only increase as global temperatures continue to warm. So this picture is showing some flooding in Pinewood, where flooding has already been an issue for years, and these types of impacts will only be exacerbated. And then another huge impact that I wanted to focus on would be the increased intensity of tropical storms or hurricanes. So we are already seeing the increased intensity. Dorian was the most intense hurricane that we had on record. And as global average temperatures move from 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees Celsius, we can expect these to continue to get worse. And hurricanes, they cause not just that short-term damage, but on the long term, they affect our economic development. There's loss of lives. And higher global temperatures mean that the intensity and the damages from hurricanes will increase. So I hope through this section, I've conveyed that there are significant differences in impacts that we're experiencing now at 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. These impacts rise at 1.5 degrees, and at 2 degrees Celsius, they get even worse. And this is particularly relevant for us here in the Bahamas. 0.5 degree of warming has dramatic differences for our quality of life, for our economy, and even for our continued occupation of our islands. And then sort of the last topic that I wanted to touch on was that the implication of these climate impacts on sustainable development. So beyond some of these direct impacts that we can see, climate change also has broader implications. And for this, I'm drawing from a concept that my colleague, Dr. Lisa Benjamin, and I developed, and it's called the unvirtuous cycle of loss and damage. Loss and damage are negative impacts of climate change. So those two are synonymous. When we talk about negative impacts of climate change, we can also call it loss and damage. And we developed this concept of a cycle to show how experiencing loss and damage actually decreases the ability of countries to develop sustainably and ends up making them more vulnerable to future climate impacts. And we talk about this further in this paper. So if you're interested, you can take a look at this paper. Oops, here we go. So the start of the cycle is experienced loss and damage. So a place experiences a significant climate impact. For our purposes, let's use a hurricane. So we have an island, a major hurricane comes through, and there are all sorts of impacts. We have loss of life, we have loss of coral reefs, we have damages to infrastructure. There's a big mess that needs to be addressed. This then brings us to the second stage of the cycle. We see a diversion of resources to address this loss and damage. So government now needs to spend some of its budget on responding to the disaster. Organizations and different groups spend their resources on helping people. Individual households and people also have to use their resources to recover from the impacts of that hurricane. This diversion of resources then means that there is less financial and human capacity available for sustainable development. So the priority becomes on recovering from the disaster, and resources that would go towards other development needs are now not available. So things like education, healthcare, addressing crime, gender equality, good governance, all of these other issues have less resources available since significant effort is going into addressing the impacts from that hurricane. And we sort of saw that with Dorian, where our budget was constrained because there was so much money spent on trying to recover from Dorian. And we saw budget cuts in other areas, such as money that was put towards education. This then leads into capacity constraints and fewer public goods. So capacity constraints in terms of human capacity. We have understaffed government agencies. We have agencies that are unable to meet their mandates. And there are fewer public goods in terms of financial resources that are available. So there's lots of research showing that when a disaster occurs, government revenue actually decreases. And so there's less money available in the national budget overall. And then the final step in the cycle is that all of this then leads to increased vulnerability to future climate change impacts. and the cycle begins again, so that when the next hurricane comes along, you are left in an even worse state than before. So this is a theoretical concept showing how climate change can actually erode sustainable development if we are not able to break the cycle at some point. And it shows how climate change has implications beyond just those immediate impacts that I talked about in the first two sections of the presentation, but it affects every aspect of society. And just to close, I'd like to highlight that the impacts of climate change are not experienced the same by everyone. Loss and damage is inequitably distributed. And so we see communities and groups that are already on the margins of society and are already struggling economically being the ones that are hardest hit by climate change impacts. And a good example of that was Hurricane Dorian. So at the Carr Center, we developed a project called I Survived Dorian, where people can share their experiences. And from this, we saw that people who didn't have really strong family and friend networks had a rough time both before and after Dorian. And then my colleague and I also just recently published a paper on climate justice, loss and damage in Dorian. And here we looked at the implications for the Haitian communities and how this intersected with human rights. So if you're interested, I encourage you to take a further look at either one of those resources and get a bit more deeper into how climate impacts affect people differently. And with that, I will wrap it up. Thank you, and I'll hand it back over.
Thank you so much. Now we will hear from Juliet Glenn Callender, who is over on our UB North campus.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Juliet Glenn Callender, and I'm the campus librarian at UB North. So today I'll be talking about libraries and archives and how climate change is affecting our libraries and archives. Right, so how is climate change affecting our libraries and our archives? So Dr. Thomas, she spoke about all the different ways that climate change is impacting our environment, our islands and everything. So they are just define a little bit of what climate change is and how is it manifesting itself. How has it impacted, who has it impacted the most? The effects of climate change on libraries and archives. I'll talk a little bit about that Dorian experience. And then what can we do to mitigate our situation? So, and I'm not a scientist or anything like that, so I'm just gonna quote something that is simple. So according to United Nations, they say that climate change refers to a long-term shift in temperatures and weather patterns. These shifts may be natural, such as through variations in the solar cycle, but yes, since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change. And of course, that's primarily through burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. And that would have started during the Industrial Revolution, which would have been the late 1800s and going over into the 1900s. And we've never moved from there, really. And that has continued. And while we talk about, the Green Revolution, we talk about looking for fuels that are more sustainable and so on, we still continue. So what has that resulted in now? And when people talk about climate change, they think about warmer temperatures, but temperature rise is only the beginning of the story. Because yes, the earth is a system and everything is connected. And what happens in one area is going to influence change in another. So we have all of these catastrophic storms now coming up. We have tornadoes occurring in places that they never occurred before. And we are still many years later, more than 2,000 years later, we are still burning our fossil fuels more than ever. And then we talk about all of those forest fires. So Europe would have experienced, while the US would have experienced forest fires, Europe is now experiencing the extreme forest fires and drought. We have more volcanic activity now in the world, and then we have tsunamis, and just to name a few, we have water scarcity. And of course, for us in the small island states, we talk about our rising sea levels and our flooding, and back again to those catastrophic storms. So when we think about that now, we come back now to how is that affecting our libraries. So there was a study done, and it was done by a group of persons, and it was supported by a grant. And this was mainly through Penn State University, and it was Mazurik and company. And their study was American Archives and Climate Change, risk and adaptations. So what they did is that, they did this study in order to measure the effects of climate change on libraries and archives, because all our studies are currently being done on the environment and everywhere and so on. But nobody's talking about our libraries and archives. Yes, we're going to have disasters, we're going to have flooding and so on. And then all of a sudden, there's no more talk about it. So the objective of this study was to raise awareness of climate risk to libraries and archives and provide the basis for institutional and regional climate adaptation planning. And this is a powerful tool, because what it does now is that it allows us to use data to support our arguments and the reasons why we want to do certain things. So they use a database of 1,232 library and archive locations in combination with the best available spatial data. And they were describing inland surface water flooding, temperature and precipitation change, sea level rise, oceanic storm surge associated with hurricanes. They found that nearly every library and archive that they examined should expect the climate conditions under which they currently operate to change over the course of roughly the next century. So their results included 18 coastal locations that would likely be inundated by at least 1.8 meters sea level rise. 84 coastal locations that would likely be inundated by a current Category 4 storm surge event if it were a direct hit to their coastline. 219 coastal locations were found to be at some risk for inundation from the combined effects of future sea level rise and storm surge. And that is where we sit. Then, of course, in all of this, we still have our risks. So we talked about those natural risks. And those natural risks, of course, would include water, fire, pests, and then we have those technological risks. So when we talk about those technological risks now, we're talking about the fact that, yes, we acknowledge that we have an issue in terms of what could happen if our collections get damaged as a result of flooding. And the flooding doesn't have to be necessarily a flood due to some weather condition. It could be just a leaky pipe or so, and that's where we get the flooding. So then we think of, okay, well, let's digitize our collections and put them, and have them online. But then we still require a server, we still require internet access, etc. And that opens us up now to technological risk. Because just like what would have happened when BTC went down a few weeks ago, we were unable to access our website. We couldn't get anything. And in the same breath, Microsoft changed its, how it does its logins or its authentication system. And to date, we still can't access our electronic resources that the library offers off campus. Again, that's a technological risk. So, you're thinking about how we are trying to mitigate all of the situations. But in everything that you do, there is still a risk. And then we talk about human caused risk. And that human caused risk might be, not acknowledging some of these risks and what we need to do to mitigate these risks. We talk about apathy and so on. And yes, it's there because, yes, I know that there's some disaster preparedness plan, but am I focusing on it? Not really. Everything is going fine and we are okay. Then, of course, day-to-day damage. Patrons borrow books or handle the books or materials, and they get damaged. And then we talk about those security risks. And again, we may have important documents, whether they're in print or digital format. What are we doing to secure them? Did we do due diligence on the vendor who's providing cloud storage for our data? And things like that. So again, talking about the risk. So, we are talking climate change is, it's just adding another layer of risk to our libraries and archives and our collections. So Dr. Thomas talked about, the 1.1, the percent and so on, 1.5% in the increase in temperature, and then the 2 degrees increase in the temperature, and how does that affect us? So one of the things is those extremes in temperature. So here in the Caribbean, it's either very hot or it's rainy. And we have seen a significant increase in temperature, and this is the daily temperature, as well as rainfall. So, and then of course, the increases in humidity. So humidity is averaging at about 77.9%, and that is on a daily basis. And then it goes a lot higher than that. And when I talk about that, I am from Trinidad, and when I came to the Bahamas, this is when I started experiencing these high levels of humidity. We didn't have that at home. It may have been hot, but it was always fairly dry. So, and then when you check the temperatures now, just using weather.com or any of those, they tell you extremely high levels of humidity, or they tell you dangerous levels of humidity. So what does that mean? And I am talking now from the layman's perspective. It means then that your floors feel damp. Everything there's moisture literally everywhere. And yes, our sunny conditions are fine for the tourists, but definitely not for our print materials. So if everything is damp all the time, because it's a simple thing, like if you want to do, you take out your photocopying paper, and maybe you're trying to make copies, but the paper keeps sticking, and you're asking yourself why. It's because the paper is damp. So it means then that the moisture in the atmosphere is high. And if you are not addressing that issue, then that eventually leads to mold. And here in the Caribbean, one of our main contenders in terms of risk would be mold. And, and again, on how to get rid of this mold. So for a long time, and yes, we addressed the situation. We got dehumidifiers, and then at one point we were emptying the reservoirs in the dehumidifiers 4-5 times a day. And that tells you the high levels of moisture in the environment. And we had dehumidifiers placed in all of our rooms, not just one large area. In some cases, there were 2 in a room. That worked for a time, but definitely not enough. And then in our special collections room, we noticed that, you're looking at and detecting signs of mold. So, and it went on like that. And, you mitigate the situation, you clean the books, you air them out, you put them out to dry and so on. But definitely a lot of our older books were continuously being affected by some kind of moisture. If you open the books and you turn the pages, they're actually feeling damp. And then we had a storage room to the back where we were keeping some of our old materials, and definitely there was mold there. Now, I could say there's mold, but we did call in an expert to check, and he said, yes, he analyzed the samples, definitely was mold, and he did that in several areas. He tested the books as well. So then what do you do? So we have the chemical treatment, we have the environmental control. So of course we had started that with the dehumidifiers, and then the chemical would have been to bring in a company to do a thorough cleaning. And then thereafter, we have to look now at our environment, because, the air conditioning system that we're using plays a part in terms of maintaining an environment which does not promote the growth of mold. So it means then that if ideally you'd want to invest in a new HVAC system that will have a proper air ventilation system, and that way it's taking all, there's an exchange of air, and that ability to remove the moisture laden air from the environment. However, that is not how the air conditioning system was not designed for that. So, and again, and every time the temperature goes up, then you lower the temperature of your AC in order to maintain the temperature inside of the rooms. However, that temperature will definitely not be the temperature that is needed to keep your collection safe. And these are the things, that we have to think about. So we're talking about climate change and the increase in the temperatures. So you're literally doing this balancing act, trying to maintain a comfortable environment for your patrons, but at the same time, the ideal temperature for your collections. And that is not just for print as well, but if you have old collections, AV materials and so on, that is exactly what they need, because they are also susceptible to mold. So, having said that, and this is one of the things, and I speak to that, and I can tell, and I can say that as well for in Trinidad, we had that running battle. We had a conservator, and every time we would have to keep calling, we literally had to put in split units in our special collections area to try to control the temperature in that specific area, because the air conditioning system was no longer working for us, because we're talking about protecting our archives and all of our cultural materials and so on, and that definitely is not happening. So we have to go ahead now and put in the split units, but again, talking about that is a cost. Is that a cost that your organization can afford? What about the regular cleaning by professionals? Is that something that you have considered? Is your budget able to afford that? Because maybe moving forward for the next year, you're going to project those costs. But again, definitely, I'm putting that in as a line item in my budget, but I need to have some evidence to support why I am asking for professional cleaning at different intervals and so on during the course of the academic year. So then I come to that Dorian experience. So Dr. Thomas talked about, the extremes and so on in temperature. And then I put it into the context now of our libraries and our archives. So September 1st, right, the Bahamas, and specifically Abaco and Grand Bahama, were devastated by a Category 5 storm called Hurricane Dorian. And and we know that this is not an unusual occurrence in the Bahamas. We have had the great Abaco hurricane from as far back as 1932, Andrew in 1992, then Floyd in 1992. And one of the things that we missed in Floyd was that the island was inundated by seawater as well. We had storm surges when Floyd hit. Maybe they may not have been as high as they were with Dorian, but definitely they were high. And they had inundated our water supply, And, there was a report that was done by the US Army Corps, I believe, and they said that it would have taken, I think, at least 25 years or so for the salt to literally be washed out, and I'm using layman terms here, for it to come out. So all of our aquifers and so on were inundated with salt water. But, and again, that happened, and, nothing was done. We moved on. Yes, we would have dug new wells and so on, but that situation still existed. Then there was Hurricane Francis in 2004. Again, we suffered heavy damages. Then later on, 2016 was Matthew, and then Maria and Irma in 2017. So this has been, a continuing, this is something that we are experiencing on a regular basis, literally. And there's a cycle to it as well. Every how many years, this is what we're going to experience. And then when we think back, 5 of those hurricanes were Category 5 and 4. And they are, and now characterized by, and the last, definitely storm surge and up to 20 feet in some of the hurricanes. So, again, structural, environmental, and economic damage. And we're looking at it over a period of time that we would have suffered that damage. And Dr. Thomas talked about that and how it sets the country back. And it does, because in 2019, it set us back. And we are still trying to recover from it. So, we talk about, well, okay, if you know that all of those hurricanes are hitting, what have you done? Okay, so we did have a disaster plan. So I talk about the plan in action now. So a couple of days before the storm hit, we were told to move everything off the floor, which we did. Now, previously, when Matthew had hit, we did get some flooding, but the flooding did not reach into the classrooms or anything like that, because initially when the buildings were constructed, the land was built up at least, I think, 6 to 8 feet or so before the buildings were put down. And then when you do your homework, you understand that that is a flood-prone area. So yes, some due diligence was done, and we did not experience any flooding. However, that was not the outcome with Dorian. So move everything off the floor, put them up on those tables, then get your pieces of plastic and cover all your book stacks, the filing cabinets and so on. Unplug all the electrical equipment and secure the premises. And you look at other disaster plans, and yes, this is what they advise you to do. However, the 20-foot storm surge came, and all of those measures were definitely ineffective. All of our books were literally washed out the door into the courtyard and covered in debris, whether it was sewage, mud, sand, whatever it was, and most of all, salt water. So we literally lost everything in the storm, all our books, our computers, files or pamphlet collection that he got it so diligently was gone because that was all in paper. We had documents that were unique to Grand Bahama. Those were gone as well. And of course, one would say, well, why didn't we digitize them? Yes, we had a plan and we were working on them, but of course, too late. So again, we have to think about these things and learn from our past experiences. Because if I can go back and tell you since whatever year this is what had happened, then what would we, what was the plan moving forward? So what can we do to mitigate the situation? So we know that climate change is real and things are not going to get better anytime soon. In fact, we now know that it's just going to get worse. And those storms that hit us every so often are going to get worse. So, and what are we going to do about it? Because every time we get ourselves back together again, a storm hits and we have to start from zero. So how do we mitigate this situation? Because it means that we now have to factor in all of these things when we are, thinking about our collections and so on, because these collections represent our cultural heritage. They represent, and in the same way we have government files and documents and so on. So they literally chronicle the lives of our people here in the Bahamas and everywhere. Newspapers were not digitized until several years ago. So we had all of these things in print, but now the newspapers are gone. Freeport News is gone. And Freeport News was not digitizing a lot of their newspapers were not in digital format or electronic format. And the Freeport News was really the one of the collectors, or I should say, they represented what took place on the island. They started as a paper, that captured social activities and major events that took place on the island. And then they started functioning as a full newspaper. So you're talking about all of that is lost, and how do we get it back? How do we protect the cultural heritage in our libraries and our archives? How do we protect those documents, the painting, the museum objects, those intangible things such as the folklore, customs, and traditional knowledge? So one of the things that we said that we would do and possible solutions is, one, now that we have that study, which was done in 2018, we can focus on the results of some of the studies. So yes, it may be US oriented, but they did their research in coastal areas. So now we have to think about, so now we can use those statistics because they mimic what we have here in the Caribbean, in our small island states. So we can use some of those statistics now in justifying why we need to include certain items in our budgets, because now we have to consider, buying equipment, putting in that technical infrastructure for digitization of our documents and our books. Then we need to, continue to convert those at-risk materials into digital format, develop an oral history project. And that was something that we started doing here, in Dorian. Talk to the people, gather their data, because that is what is going to feed into not just the institutional plan, but also the government's plan. So the goal is not just to have a disaster preparedness plan. The goal should now be to have a disaster management plan that will not only address that will also address the recovery process, and that is of the physical infrastructure social and economic aspects. And then one of the things that we need to do is, again, these come at a cost, because Dr. Thomas talked about that unvirtuous cycle. And yes, we are caught in it. It's literally as if we're on a hamster wheel going around and around. Every time we catch ourselves, we get hit again. How do we get off of that hamster wheel? So it means then that some kind of proactive budgeting needs to be done. We need to look at what the other countries similar to us in the Caribbean are doing and how effective are they. Then, and how can we, develop a plan will not only address the immediate needs of the institution, but the needs of the community as well, because we need that support in terms of we need that support from our community, because that's what we use to bargain for what we require. We need that support. We need public outcry as to why what we're doing is so important. Why do we need to preserve our cultural heritage? What are the functions of the libraries and the archives? Why do we need to ensure that that function still continues? And again, using the hurricane as a learning tool for the institution. We need to, we need to use that. So some of the strategies, and again, it would be create a disaster and recovery plan, create plans for normal risk as well as natural disasters, train our personnel in basic conservation practices, because that is something that we don't have. Because when the disaster occurred, some members of the Smithsonian came to the island, and they asked us, what had we done? Of course, there wasn't very much that we could do, because of course all our things were covered in salt water and mud and so on, and of course sewage. So there's nothing to salvage. But even if there were, what could have we done in the short term and the long term? So we definitely need to train our personnel in basic conversation practices. Yes, I'm a librarian. Yes, I would know some basic things. I would know, yes, let's take our books, wipe them off, put them out into the sun to dry and so on. But we don't have any freezer here that can dry our books or anything like that. So what do we do in the short term if we can't invest in those things? And then, that type of investment requires that you will be using that on a continuous basis. So what can we do in the short term? What resources can we access in the long term? We need to have regular meetings to ensure that all our staff members are aware of what to do in case of an emergency. And we're talking about now general risk, and then in case of all these natural disasters and so on, that we know are going to come. It is not if we think it is going to come, we know that it is coming. It is just when and how prepared we are. We talk about the loss of income, how it is literally impoverishing our countries. Every time we have to keep fixing and fixing again. So we need to find ways that will lessen the outlay, financial outlay, in terms of having to keep starting from scratch. So yes, we are going to maintain those print collections and so on. Let's start digitizing those collections, so that they are there electronically, so that, well, if God forbid something happens and they get damaged, that's okay. We are all right, and we continue to manage. We need to update those plans on a regular basis to make sure that they're up to date with what is taking place now. When we are planning our new buildings, ensure that we include systems that will monitor and regulate the internal environment of a building. We talked about the rising sea levels, looking at those maps of Grand Bahama and of Nassau. That is something that we need to observe, because what happens is when somebody says, oh, we're going to give you land to put your building on, we need to be cognizant of the fact that that is the area that they are giving us the land in is a flood prone area. Is the government going to give us sufficient funding to design the structure that will help to mitigate any possible flooding in the future? Other thing is, where do you locate your libraries and your archives? Can't locate them on the ground floor, because that's the first place that the water is going to get to. You have to think now of moving them up to the second floor. And that is a key thing. And again, where the building is located, there are maps that show the storm surge, and there were maps that showed the storm surge from Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Let's start using the data and mapping that we have to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes twice, and that we don't have to, again, keep starting from scratch all of the time. And let's get involved in research that is taking place on climate change. And this is speaking to libraries and archives, so that we'll have a seat at the table when it comes to decision making, because we need to do that, because this is in our interest. We talk about, some people say, oh, the librarians are the gatekeepers of information. Okay, that is great. What information are we what are we keeping? Because if every time something happens, moisture hits, fire hits, whatever hits, and we lose everything, then we are guarding nothing. So we have to ensure that there's always something that we have. We assist in the dissemination of information. If we have no information to disseminate, then we have no role to play in all of this. So it means that we have to ensure that we have statistics to back up exactly what we're seeing. So when we submit our case to the government, we have a credible argument to give. And we're not just making statements of, oh yes, well, it's going to flood and this is why we have to do this and why we have to do that. The University of Bahamas signed an agreement, with University of Hawaii, I guess to work with them on research and so on. And, it's very instructive, because Hawaii would have gone through similar experiences as we have. And, let's work and use that partnership. Let's talk to the librarians out there, see how they are coping with any types of, risk that they encounter, and not necessarily the hurricanes. Now, yes, we're going to get that from them, but general risk, so that we know how to plan for our future. So I end my presentation here, and I open it up for any questions. Thank you.
No question, but just a comment. Yeah, this is Elsie Bain. Can you hear me?
Yes. If she's not.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, in regards to, I guess, climate change, and you spoke about the increase in the humidity that's adding to, I guess, the growth of mold in the library. And I kind of wondered about that, because I remember the first 20 years of my employment was over at the old library building, which was in the A block. And during that period, we never had a mold problem. There were windows that were not closed properly. The air condition went down every summer. But again, there was no presence of mold in the collection. after we moved to this new building, within 3 months, 5 months, we had an outbreak of mold. So, and I'm thinking that even with climate change and the increase in moisture, it would not have happened so rapidly with us moving over in this building. So I'm trying to figure out if things have changed too in terms of the building material, the, I guess to rebuild on what they call a pond, because this was where the new library building is now. I understand that this was actually a pond that they filled in. So I'm wondering too, are there other things that can contribute to, I guess, the collection in terms of mold and moisture that doesn't necessarily relate to climate change?
Yeah, and definitely that is so, because where were we located? We were located in East Grand Bahama. When you look at the maps, that was a flood-prone area. And, they built up the foundation to put the university on. So were those measures to put in place to mitigate mold? Because when you're constructing houses, normally you have in the foundation, you have to put down a layer of plastic, and that is what they call the moisture barrier. Are those moisture barriers being used? And again, if you're building in an area that is prone to moisture, we are in trouble. But then most of the time, that's where the land is available. So, gathering the data and so on, probably at least will help us a little bit to maybe say, well, no, this is not where we want to be located. I'm sure Dr. Thomas can speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, in addition to climate change making things worse, we have to do better about where we're siting buildings in the first place. And as I showed with that map of sea level rise, you can see places that are going to be completely unsuitable for any type of building. And unfortunately, that covers most of our islands. So we need to start thinking very critically from now about where we're going to continue to build, how we're going to continue to build, so that we don't make the impacts that climate change brings even worse by, building in places that are already unsuitable. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other burning questions, so I think that might have been it. But thank you, both of you, so much for such a wonderful session. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for Archives Month, and then this session, which is also in conjunction with Open Access Week. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you. Okay, bye.